You're watching a special live presentation on the BeTerrific Network.
My name's Adam Bernstein. I'm the executive director of the New Group, and welcome to New Group Now, our panel discussion on addiction, mental health, and Hamish Linklater's The Whirligig. Also, we're streaming live tonight on BeTerrific, so welcome to everyone out there online tuning in as well. For those of you that are maybe unfamiliar with the New Group, we are a nonprofit off-Broadway theater. We're in our 22nd year of producing theater. We do 4 shows a year out of this amazing space here at the Signature Center. And just a little bit about the New Group mission. We develop and produce contemporary work, and then another part of what we do is presenting theater that is now, and by that we mean theater that deals with themes, topics, issues that are socially and culturally relevant. And I can't think of a topic more timely right now than what's going on in our country with opioid addiction, and sort of one of the central issues of the play, The Whirligig, is a girl that is dying to her addiction and other health issues surrounding that. But I think more at its core, it's about the community around this young woman and how they've come together to deal with that. And so we're hopeful that sparks some lively discussion this evening. The Whirligig runs here in the Griffin Theater through June the 18th. So if you haven't seen the show yet, we really hope that you come out and join us on your way in. We passed out some postcards with a special discount offer for you, so we hope that you'll take advantage of it. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for the evening. He is the host of WNYC's podcast, The United States of Anxiety, which airs Tuesdays at 8, and you can also download the podcast. Give a warm welcome to Mr. Kai Wright.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a fabulous discussion with a group of really smart people and really talented people. I can tell you because I've been in the back talking to them all already, and so I'm going to bring them all out and bring you all into that conversation too. Let us begin with, I suppose, the man of the hour, Scott Elliott, who is the founding artistic director of the New Group and has a great many both Broadway and off-Broadway credits, but for tonight's purposes is the director of The Whirligig. And we are also pleased to have another person from the production, Alex Hurt, who similarly has a great many credits to his record, but for tonight's purposes, most importantly, plays Greg in The Whirligig. And then we have 3 experts in this topic we're going to be wrestling with tonight, who are all have dedicated a great deal of their lives to coming to understand this, and so I'm excited to hear from them. We have Maya Salovich, who is a journalist and who writes a great deal about addiction, and most recently her New York Times bestseller is Unbroken Brain: A Revolutionary New Way of Understanding Addiction. Welcome, Maya. Liz Evans is the executive director of Washington Heights Corner Project and New York Harm Reduction, who has been working with people experiencing homelessness and drug addiction and drug use, for over 25 years. Welcome, Liz. And last but certainly not least, we have Leslie Daly, who is the clinical psychologist at the Center for Motivation and Change, a private group practice specializing in treatment and substance abuse here in New York City. So now you guys are going to have to use one mic and pass it along as we talk, and so you'll share nicely, and everybody's going to hop in to the conversation when you've got something to add. But I want to start with Scott. And for the people who have not yet seen the production, maybe give us just a very quick idea of what the show is about and why you felt like this was the show to do now.
Well, the play is, Adam did a pretty good job explaining the play. It's about a young, well, it's not really about her. She's sort of the center of it, but a young woman who is dying as a result of her opioid addiction, among other things. And it's sort of about all of the people around her. That's who the play is really about, and how they figure into her demise. That's what it's about. It sounds very bleak, but it's quite uplifting and sort of and funny and emotional as well. And I did it because, other than the fact that when I read it, I fell in love with the writing. And I love the parts for all the actors, and that's a big part of what we do here. And but I also felt that it tapped into something about the human condition that I found really moving and relevant. That's why I did it.
We're going to come back to that relevant part. Alex, you play Greg, as I've said. Give us a sense of Greg's role, and I have to say, for me, he seems like, near as I can tell, he's the only person who is not either in addiction or somehow complicit in one of the tragedies of the show.
Or medicated.
Yeah, I would say medicated. I don't think he's not complicit.
Tell us a little bit about him, and then I have another question.
Okay, so I play a character named Greg, and he is a sober bartender, bar owner in this town in Great Barrington. He's married. He has 2 children. I guess he has a connection to this girl mostly through his wife, who was best friends with her when they were younger and started using drugs together and exploring that sort of lifestyle. And he also has a connection to her through her father, who he looked up to as a sort of a male role model, because he didn't really have one as a child. He also, just in terms of the history of the play, comes from an alcoholic family and received a great deal of abuse growing up. And I think that's the main reason that he's become a very solid member of Al-Anon and of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a really cool, I mean, the nature of addiction is a fantastic topic to me, and it was a big part of my research for the part. The question I still ask myself every night is how difficult it must be to be a bartender and be sober and be around alcohol all the time,
Well, and also the thing that strikes me about Greg is, so everybody feels in the show feels trapped in some way, in something. I was thinking of him as the closest to sober, but at the same time felt the most trapped to me. And I guess I just put that to you in terms of Greg's internal life. What's going on for him? Why am I feeling like he's trapped, or where do you see it?
Well, I think that in terms of the play, it takes place over one night, one evening. It starts at probably about 6 p.m. and ends at like 3 a.m. in the backyard. And there are some time lapses that go back 15 years, but for the most part, that evening is, I think, just a very tense evening. It's like we find ourselves in a lot of plays, like we're seeing these people at a very high stakes moment. So if there is some, what was the word you used exactly?
I said, well, I used trapped. I said he feels emotionally trapped.
So I think that Greg is a little trapped because his wife, who he knows he knows that she has had a very emotional roller coaster of a life. She had a baby when she was very young and didn't end up maybe fulfilling her full potential, which he does blame himself for. I think in a lot of ways he is complicit in that, and he was also complicit in her not being friends with this girl anymore, which might be a reason that he has a part in her addiction, that he took her best friend away, who could have maybe said, hey, we gotta pump the brakes on this heroin stuff now, Julie, like let's not do this. But I think that in this moment, he gets very scared that his wife is going to leave him. And the last scene where I think that he sort of emotionally is erupting, what he's saying to her is, choose me, please choose me, like don't, because all he cares about is her. He's so totally in love with her. She's his solution to everything. But time and time again, what happens to him, the trap for him is that he's always responsible. He always makes the right decision. And when his girlfriend who's 17 comes to him and says, I'm pregnant, he says, okay, cool, let's do this. And when his teacher who comes to him and says, I need to get sober now, he's like, okay, I'm gonna help you. And then at the end of the play, they just say, well, you can go now, man. We don't need you anymore. So that's his trap.
Scott, just to follow up on that idea, I mean, there's a lot of people, it feels to me like a lot of people worried each other are gonna leave one another or have left one another, and the sort of connection, disconnection seems to be a big theme running throughout. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think isn't that life in a weird way? It sort of keeps us all going, that fear of being rejected, I think, or, we think about things like that. At least I do. Everybody's looking at me. Am I the only one who ever feels that way?
No.
But I think that's what I think is the interesting human element of the whole thing, is that it has a, people are on edge the whole time and worried that their lives are not going to go. There's a lot of solipsism in the play too. People are sort of in their own worlds, and then they're trying to connect with others. And yeah, I think that is an interesting sort of thought about like what's happening in the play. The need for connection, the fear of not having connection. It's sort of, I don't know. I think interestingly, we pick these plays years in advance, and so you have to sort of think, try to be prescient in some way, to pick plays that might be speaking to the culture when they're going to get done. And in the case of this one, I don't know why, there's something about the current state of I think I know why, but but there's something about like the need for connection and the need for community feels so interesting now, even like in some of the Broadway shows that I've gone to see that people are enjoying. There's this sort of need for connection and community. And yeah.
Well, we'll get back to some of these real personal ideas that are coming up in the play, but I want to pull back for a second and Maya, ask you, talking about it. Pass that mic on down here. Sorry, we're going to have to.
Oh no, this one.
We're going to have to be team players on this. Thinking about the sort of relevance of this moment and the big picture of this moment, for those of us who maybe aren't aware, we are in the middle of what has been called, I think, the worst drug epidemic in our history. Is that correct? Give us a sense of what's happening right now in terms of opioid addiction.
So, we're really in the midst of what's an overdose epidemic. We've certainly had a lot of periods of very high levels of drug use that were possibly higher in the late 70s, early 80s, but people are dying now. And there was an article in the New York Times today about how the figures are continuing to climb despite our attempts to deal with it. And I would argue that our attempts to deal with it are actually driving those numbers higher, because what we've done is we had an epidemic that was largely driven by people who were taking prescription painkillers, and they got them usually they got them from their friends and family, but those friends and family had gotten them from a doctor. And so those drugs were of a known dose and purity. Now we shut the pill mills, we're telling doctors not to prescribe for pain, we're actually harming a lot of people with pain by just cutting them off and leaving them. But what we have also done is the people with addiction have been driven to the street and to using heroin, which is now cut with fentanyl. There's a principle known as the iron law of prohibition. And this idea is that when you crack down on a substance, what will happen is a purer, more dangerous form of that substance will arise. And that's because it's easier to smuggle smaller things. And smaller drugs are, like fentanyl, which is like 100 times more powerful than morphine, is much smaller and easier to smuggle than heroin. It's also a lot cheaper to make than heroin because you don't have to grow any poppies. And this is upending the entire drug business and is going to have a lot of repercussions that we have not yet seen in terms of weird things like unemployment amongst poppy growers. But we also, but I mean,
Traditionally, it's a field that manages on its own, but.
The real thing is that it is killing people, and we have focused relentlessly on the supply. And the thing that I think has been fascinating about this play is that it's focusing on the demand and why people become addicted. One of the things I really loved about it is that in most of what we see and hear in this culture about addiction, the blame is always placed solely either on the drug or on the person with addiction themselves. And in this play, people around the addicted person are looking at like, well, maybe how did I contribute to this? And they are not sitting there and you know, blaming her. Another thing I just want to add really quickly.
Let me, before you add that, let me ask you to clarify. So your opening thought that we have an overdose epidemic, not a drug use epidemic. And I just want I want to make sure we understand that people are overdosing more. You feel like we haven't seen a spike in the amount of use. We've seen it's a consequence.
We've certainly seen an increase in opioid use, but drug use tends to be cyclical in this country. So like every 10 years we have an epidemic of either a stimulant or a depressant. So like you've got 70s heroin, 80s cocaine, 90s methamphetamine, O's opioids, and we're quite due for a stimulant epidemic, and indeed cocaine use is starting to rise. So what basically happens is people get scared of the prior generation's demon drug, but our drug is okay. So, you know, in the 80s we thought, like in the 90s people thought like, well, cocaine, crack, that's the worst drug, but heroin, that's okay. And it goes back and forth because the media never gets it through its head that, like, no, we have actually a problem with people seeking escape, not a problem with particular substances, except for that some substances are indeed more deadly than others. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And fentanyl is particularly causing.
Yeah.
All right. Liz, let me ask you, sort of to build on what Maya was just saying there in terms of the history of this, that there's a part of this conversation where we're saying, oh, in the last couple of years, we've noticed a opioid epidemic because it's hit, at least in the media telling of it, a middle class and or white population. But others say that, listen, this is an epidemic that we've had for decades. It's not changed. It's always been there. Is that a fair characterization? Talk to me about sort of the length of this problem and the way it shows up in varying communities.
I'm not from New York. I've been here for about a year. I've spent most of my adult life working in Canada with drug users. So I know here the profile of the people that I'm working with right now are predominantly African American, and they have been dying, and their communities have been impacted in New York by drug overdose deaths for a very long time. This is not a new epidemic, and many people tell me that they're very offended by the fact that now people who are white are dying. There's been more attention being paid to the issue. I do know that in our policies about how we treat people who use drugs, we are giving them very few options except to die. And so where I would piggyback off what Maya is saying is, it isn't the drug, and it's not that drugs are good or bad, and they're not inert either. They have an effect. But the way we treat people when they are using these substances that are illicit, which I find ironic in the play because everybody was using something. You know, most people except you were somehow dependent on some substance to get them through their day. And I thought that was really beautifully handled because it made it so much about we're all coping in some way, and yet here's this central character, this woman whose life is really been dramatically affected by it in the sense that she's dying, although it's cancer, not really drugs that she's dying from, right? I did really struggle with that.
From her, I have to say.
Yeah,
Yes.
but certainly in the work that I'm doing now, just last week on Thursday, a car pulled up in front of our office and 3 people in the car were overdosing at the same time. We had to run out and give them naloxone and CPR. And that same day, somebody overdosed in our bathroom. So this is a constant problem here in the city. It's happening today. And I would argue that we have a choice about whether or not we want to look at it. or not. And looking at it with the same policy lens that we've looked at it historically hasn't solved the problem. It's making it harder and harder for people to come out of the shadows. And I think what, again, was beautiful about this play to me was the humanity of it. And I think that it was very touching that each character's issues and pain were handled really beautifully, and I felt mostly just empathy and sympathy with and empathy for each character. And I think that every drug user I've ever met, no matter how impoverished and brutalized or how many times they've been in jail, or no matter what their life story has been, no matter what color their skin is, they're just a human being. And they have a story and they have a position in their life that has gotten them where they've gotten to. And I've never met one person that I haven't been able to feel that same love for in that way.
Have you watched, I have a loud voice. I have a big loud voice. So it's okay, you can,
Is that
you can hear me, right? Did you watch that Cape Cod documentary on HBO about the heroin epidemic in Cape Cod? I thought it was brilliant. We all watched it. It sort of addressed, it just addressed the humanity of the whole thing in a way that was shocking. It's on HBO Demand if anybody is interested in that. I think it's called Heroin Cape Cod.
Yeah,
or something like that. Yeah. And
it was made a few years back, but yeah,
it's pretty amazing. It definitely brings it into, it shows a community affected by it, which I think is so interesting because it really is a community affected like this community in the play. And I was particularly moved recently when I saw this photo of this sort of seemingly middle-aged couple. Do you see that photo? They're in the front seat of the car. They're nodded, and the baby's sitting in the back in the car seat, just wide awake, just like waiting it out, I guess, in the car. And on the news this morning, I heard that there was an inordinate amount of overdoses on Long Island. That there's a huge epidemic and that the stuff is very bad, and there have been so many more overdoses. I can't remember the number, but it was shocking.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, and then I want to
Yeah, sure. Two things very quickly. So the thing about that photo is there's a lot of data that shows that those kind of photos make people want to crack down on drugs and be cruel to drug users because those parents are incredibly irresponsible. They're putting their pleasure in front of their child. They are destroying their child's life. They should be put in jail. They should be publicly shamed. So there's been a real fight within the recovery community to stop using those images because what people with addiction and their children, by the way, you are shaming that child. Like they sort of blocked out the child's face so that you couldn't see their identity. But of course, the people in that community know whose child belongs to that parent. So we know for decades, and we've known this, that shame, punishment, and humiliation harms people with addiction. And that addiction itself is defined as compulsive behavior that continues despite punishment. So why are we trying to use punishment in order to fix it? So I think we have to be very, very careful about the images that we show because you might be moved by it, but so many other people are like, those gross people should be shot.
Mm-hmm. Leslie, let's talking a little bit about what can be done. It's come up, the word community keeps coming up, and certainly in the show, it's really, as we've said, it's less about the young woman at the center than the community around her. We hear very little of her, we hear all about the community around her. And so I guess I want you to talk about that a little bit in terms of thinking about treatment and what we do for folks is how does community play a role in this?
Right, well I think we know, to your point, that often fear has been a big component of trying to get people into treatment or trying to shame them into treatment, and we know that's actually not helpful. In fact, change doesn't occur when we're afraid, right? We want to be sort of feeling connected to people and open and softened, and we're taking a risk. We want to be in a supportive community. So certainly, something like 12-step, which does offer community, there's a huge benefit to that. And if people don't feel particularly connected, to that approach, there hasn't really been an alternative. And so what's missing is, a sense of a compassionate, group that can offer support. And I think now, hopefully, we're moving a little bit more toward offering alternatives to saying that what you do need is understanding, compassion, connection, as you guys are saying, which was, really a moving component of the play. I thought was depicting the dynamics of like hearing each other and when people didn't hear each other, or when there wasn't something that wasn't said in a moment, maybe people were too caught up in their own experience, and what's not shared in those moments, like those are the missed opportunities, which was such a big question posed. Like, when could something else have happened? When could I have listened? When could I have just heard what needed to be said? And so hopefully in treatment, we're moving toward a place where we can offer people who are struggling on the whole continuum of substance use to be listened to actually check in with, what do you want to do? How do you think this is going to affect your life? What kind of changes do you want to make? And connecting them with other people who are in a similar spot. It's the most powerful.
I'd say one thing it made me think of, well, it made me think of two things. One is, I've had people in my own life who were in addiction, not opioids, but other things, and how difficult that was for everybody around us, and how much conflict it created between those of us not with him, but with each other about him and about things that we thought were about other stuff, but were actually about him. And I wonder about how, I started thinking about how helpful or hurtful were we being to him in the middle of all that. And I guess in thinking about treatment, how do you engage with people around someone who is in treatment?
It's so important to figure out how we can offer, treatment for, I guess, just ideas and community for the loved ones, sort of the significant others, the partners, the friends. And a lot of it is like disentangling some of what feels really personal about someone's behavior, maybe like while they're intoxicated or while they're looking for a drug, or there's so much anger, sometimes there's so much resentment, and that gets in the way then of actually, again, listening or being present, or engaging someone in a way where you're giving them options instead of saying, this is what you need to do to make this better, to say, okay, let's listen to what you want to do and how we can try to guide you in that way, or we're just here for you, which is the difference. So understandably, the loved ones are always like, resentful and upset and angry, and yet if we can help them sort of pull back to understand that the behavior is not meant to be hurtful to the people around them, I think often that opens some space for change.
And this question of fault, either Alex or I keep wanting to call you Greg. Either Alex or Scott. This question of fault, whose fault is it, comes up a lot in the show. Just tell me about how you guys thought about that in terms of it seems like such a driving piece of the work is who's to blame for what happened.
Scott, the first day of rehearsal, said that the other title of this play would be The Blame Game. Mm-hmm. And in a theatrical process, what I find serves best when working with the director is when they give you something that inspires everything that comes from that. And usually it's in the first day of rehearsal. It's the first thing out of their mouth. And that's what he said first day. So we were all just on that right away. That was the first seedling. And it's funny because for all of us, I think all of us as actors in the cast and for every designer that took part in this process, and even for Hamish as he was doing rewrites while we were in rehearsal, that was the start of it. And I think for Greg, I know for Greg, because I am Greg, at the end of the play, he sort of considers what's happening utter insanity, that a sober person who was sober for 7 years, that he helped get sober, or tried to, and for some time, who on that night has decided to just toss it and fall off the wagon. I mean, with good reason, as good a reason as any, honestly. Has decided to bring a drug dealer into his house to visit with his daughter, who was the drug dealer that started giving her drugs. And I think that he also sort of considers he's one of these people who shames others a little bit. And I don't think it's that he actively is out there shaming them, but I think it's just a way that his mind has had to develop to work and to exist in the world, which is, Yeah, at the end, like there's literally two things going on in my head. You did this, choose me, you did this. You know, and that's why he snaps, you know, because, I mean, the idea of someone being the drug dealer who gave his wife heroin when she was pregnant with his daughter is just way too much for him.
I can imagine how.
Yeah, but yeah, I think for him he believes that, you know, like they teach in AA, every single person is responsible for themselves. That we have to admit our own problems. I think he tries to lead by example, and that's mostly what he does. But also, he sees that what these people are doing, blaming themselves for this girl's death, is a fantasy.
Liz, Maya, Leslie, any of you, this fault question also feels like, I gather all of you agree that we talk about addiction incorrectly politically in our society, but it feels like it's a real big part of the block, is we all want to know whose fault is it that we have this epidemic, whose fault is it? Talk to me about the role of seeking, of the blame game in solving this problem culturally.
Sure, well, I think blaming has been a real problem in the way we've dealt with this. We've thought like, oh, if we can just get rid of these evil drug dealers, we will fix it. The problem is that the vast majority of people who are selling drugs are also people who are addicted to drugs. And so if you want to throw those people away, you're basically throwing away the same people that you're trying to save. And the idea that if we cut off the supply of one thing, we can fix this problem, you might be able to push people towards more or less dangerous substances or activities. But unless you understand why people are in pain, what people are trying to cope with, and what they need, it is going to be impossible to solve addiction. Because it's like trying to solve addiction by getting rid of drugs is like trying to solve OCD by getting rid of soap. Like if you're doing compulsive hand washing, you're just going to switch to another brand if you ban one brand of soap, right? So we have really gotten this problem wrong on a fundamental level. And one of the ways in which we have done that is we have called addiction dependence historically. Now, thankfully, the DSM has gotten rid of that because people are actually very dependent on each other. We're all interdependent, we are not independent. And codependency was another absurd concept that came out of the idea that addiction means depending on something. Addiction actually does not mean depending on something. Addiction means compulsive behavior that continues despite punishment. If you depend on something and it's working for you, it is not addiction. And this is why we've had such a real problem with using the treatment that we have. We have 2 treatments that can cut the death rate from opioid addiction 50% or more. This is ongoing, possibly lifelong use of either methadone or Suboxone. And that data comes from around the world. It is irrefutable. Every single agency that has ever taken an honest scientific look at it has said, look, you put this stuff into people, you allow people access to these medications, the deaths go down. You take these medications away, the deaths go up. But we have fixated on the idea that if you have a substance in your body that you are dependent on, you are addicted. And therefore, people who are on methadone or Suboxone are not really in recovery. And this has been an unfortunate problem with the 12-step model of addiction because it has become, in some senses, fixated on the idea that that recovery means abstinence from everything. And that if you have a substance in your veins, that means that you are not in recovery, even if you are not compulsively using despite negative consequences, even if that substance is actually keeping you alive, allowing you to function, allowing you to be there for your family and friends. So I feel like, one of the things that we've done wrong is pathologize dependence. Dependence is not the problem. The problem is compulsion despite consequences. And when we understand what addiction really is, then we can figure out, cutting the supply of drugs is not possible, but cutting the supply of pain might be.
To pitch to one of you to sort of give you something to follow up on that is so I hear that intellectually, right? I hear what you're saying in terms of this is a model of treatment. but culturally, politically, emotionally, how do you communicate that idea? I guess I can hear people in my life who have, and hear myself when I was dealing with people in my life who had addiction problems, being told, well, it's fine as long as that person is controlling it, it's fine. Help me articulate that for me in a way that gets me to think about how we make this shift in thinking about addiction to, help me do it not intellectually, help me do it emotionally.
Well, I keep thinking about this study. I don't know if you know the Rat Park study. Have you heard about this? It's a very famous study. Rat Park was a study that was done by Professor Bruce Alexander, where he studied rats in a cage. It was done a long, long time ago, where he put rats in a cage. They were on their own, and in the cage was water and a bottle that had an addictive substance in it. I can't remember if it was morphine or, yeah. And so they studied the nature of addiction in this cage with this rat. And over time, the rat would go back to the and drink the morphine. And the moral of the story was these substances are so addictive that these rats will continue to reuse the substance until they die. And therefore, drugs are so bad for you that you will just compulsively continue to use them until you die. Then he thought about it, and he thought, well, let's put the rats in a different cage together, in something he called Rat Park, where he put rats of both sexes together, and he put toys and food and water and other options and the same drug. And of course, the response was completely different. And while some rats did go and try the drug water, none of them died. And it was about this concept that community connection is actually what people need. And it's about the cage that we're living in. And there's a lot of different allegories you can take from that story, which I think are very relevant to this conversation about what is it that people need and where do we as family members and as friends of people that are struggling with drug use fit in. Because I've worked with people who have long since been abandoned by their family and their support networks and their communities, because I understand that it's incredibly difficult. And oftentimes I meet the family members at the funerals, and they cry and they grieve because they didn't know physically how to be there with their loved ones. And there isn't a lot of good messaging around there that says your family member or your friend who's struggling with drug use actually needs you still to be in their life, and not to shame them or reject them or tell them what they're doing every day is bad and you'll only talk to them if they stop using. And so people get really hung up on this idea of enabling and fostering dependency by being nice or loving to people while they're still using. And yet, my experience of most drug users is that the people that I have met and worked with who are stuck in very problematic use, they feel like shit. They don't feel like their lives matter. They don't feel like anyone actually cares about them tremendously. And God knows why. It's like a huge, I don't know why some people end up becoming problematic drug users and some people don't. And I've worked with lots of people who've gone through lots of things who aren't, and lots of people who've gone through lots of things that do have problems with drug use. I think it's a really complicated, very complicated picture, which is also what I liked about the play. It didn't try and make it simple. It didn't try and make it like there was one simple magical reason why this thing happened. Everyone's stories were kind of similarly complicated, which it is. But what I do know is that when I have worked with people who are using and done things that are kind and made their lives better, they do better. So when someone is homeless, it's hard for them to stop using drugs. So like if you're saying to someone who's smoking in the middle of a divorce, this would be a really great time for you to try and quit smoking, we obviously inherently know that makes no sense. But for some reason, we push people into more and more difficult situations when they're addicted to drugs that we don't approve of societally, and expect miraculously for that pushing them into really difficult dark spaces to make it somehow simpler for them to change. And that is just the exact opposite of the policy direction that we need to be going in. And it's that idea that we can bring in love and we can bring in compassion and still have boundaries and not give everybody money and not like let them steal from our car. But those are policy problems, right? Like, why do people have to break into your car or sell their bodies for sex to buy their drugs? Like, those are situations and circumstances that we have created. Those individuals don't want to do that any more than we want them to.
Before you hop in, we're going to want to hear from you guys as well. your questions, thoughts, comments for the panel, so get yourselves ready. Please be ready to chime in. Okay.
I just want to say that I myself am actually a former heroin and cocaine addict, and I recovered actually through the very traditional 12-step method. And over time, as I read the data and sort of learned more, because that was basically the only option that they were told me, like, the only alternative is jails, institutions, and death. And if you don't do that, I was at the point, at this time, I was like facing 15 years to life under the Rockefeller laws because I was selling to support my habit. So, and I was 80 pounds and incredibly, covered with tracks, the whole deal. So when, at that point, it wasn't like I was seeking extra pleasure. Like, the whole thing that had trapped me in addiction was not that I was like a hedonist who, just wanted to party all the time and was a completely unproductive person. I mean, I'd been like a straight A student and I was at Columbia. It was this inner pain and this inner self-hatred and this sense that, nobody could ever love me if they knew who I was, so that I had to like do in order to get people to like pretend to like me because I'd be successful. So you can imagine like what living with that kind of self-hatred might do and how anesthesia might feel if you were living with that. But over time, I came to see that, while this had helped me, the abstinence stuff had helped me, I also started to need antidepressants after a while, and that helped remarkably. I just started to realize that, like, we see all other groups of people as distinct. Like, if I said, I can speak for all white women, people would laugh at me. I can't speak for all people with addiction. What I can say is that addiction is enormously varied. About 50 to 60% have extreme childhood trauma. About the same proportion have another mental illness that often usually preceded the problem. There are as many ways into addiction as there are out of it. And we have, in the past, I have been there saying like, well, this is my story, so this is the way everybody should do it. Like, no, that's not science. Like, we do medicine by saying, look, here's a clinical trial. This works for X% of people, not like, I had brain surgery and now I'm a brain surgeon. In order to improve addiction treatment, what we have to do is do what the science says works, and, dead people cannot recover.
Leslie, talking about access to treatment, or others too, if you want to chime in on this, but where are we in terms of the ability, so you've decided you want to get treatment and the ability to actually get it. I understand that is not a small matter.
It's not great. We're not in a great position. I mean, even being within the field and working with people who are ready for increased levels of care, sometimes it's really hard to find the right place for them in terms of the approach they want and what they're willing, to do, and how they want to approach their disorder, substance use. So I think we're getting better. I think it's a matter of changing the conversation around addiction and the words we use to describe people who are struggling with it even, and to acknowledge what's sort of embedded culturally, and the shame and the fear and the otherness that's all wrapped up in it, and to make it a more sort of human approach is going to help.
Yeah. We've all used a little different language. I'm struggling.
Sure.
What are my right words? Give us a quick, here are the words we shouldn't be using, and here are the words we should be using.
Some of the words that are damaging, I would say, would be like clean, dirty, manipulative, addict to some degree isn't all that helpful.
As a noun.
As a noun, right? What other? Dependence, junkie, codependence, abuse.
So what are the right words?
Person with substance use disorder.
Yeah, person struggling with substance use disorder, negative for all substances, testing positive for a substance, adjective, right, so a description of, right, so it's like, let's bring the humanity back in instead of this sort of divisive otherness, which is like so relevant in our world today, and how much that is driving us into the wrong direction. So
some people just like people who use drugs too.
Some people just prefer to be described as a person who uses drugs as opposed to a problematic addicted drug user, because they don't define themselves by that. The drug use is part of who they are. It's not their entire definition. I think we get really wrapped up in that too.
Yeah.
And on a policy level, on a literal access to treatment level, as I gather, tell me if I'm wrong, that one of the things about the Affordable Care Act was that it significantly opened the door to a number of people who were able or were financed to get treatment, correct? Can you give me
in terms of coverage and access to care, it did create a better situation.
Yeah, the problem is that the care that people have access to is not based on evidence. So about 80% of addiction treatment in America is teaching people the 12 steps and telling them don't take drugs and go to meetings after treatment. And you can get that for free in a church basement. So I don't think, as a taxpayer and as somebody who has insurance, that we should be paying for what you can get for free at a church basement. You pay $58,000 a month for Betty Ford, and basically what you are taught there is the same thing that you hear in 12-step groups. So I think because you cannot get for free evidence-based things like medication, like cognitive behavioral therapy, like motivational enhancement therapy, like dialectical behavioral therapy, all of which have been shown to be at least equally as effective, if not more so for some people, as 12-step, I think that those should be what you get in treatment. But at this moment, that is not the case. Also, at this moment, everybody tends to think that we need inpatient residential rehab, and that this is the standard of care. It's the best thing you could get. You go away for 30 days, you're all good after that, you go to AA after that, everything's good. In fact, Hazelden and Betty Ford, which were the pioneers of this 12-step model, have only recently and only grudgingly begun to provide medication for people, because Hazelden in particular discovered that many, many, many people were dying 2 days a week after they left. Because when you get abstinent and then you're abstinent 30 days and then you go back out into an environment where there's fentanyl and you relapse, your risk of death is something like 67 times greater than before you went into treatment if you are not on medication. So we have done a very silly thing. Like, the Affordable Care Act is great and we should keep it and we should move towards single payer and all this good stuff. But we should not fund treatment without accountability. Treatment should be based on evidence, just like the way it is for cancer. It should not be the case that I can get victimized by rogue treatment providers, which happens all the time in this field, unfortunately. People go into these rehabs. There's been several exposés of this lately. They are being paid for your body, and they are, they get paid for the drug testing, they paid for the, it's just like, it's become, addicts, people with addiction are like a cash cow. And so while we definitely need more treatment, we need more good treatment even better.
Now we have Chris Christie, poster boy for opioid addiction, right?
Yeah.
That's very helpful.
Made it a big part of what he hopes to be his legacy.
Amazing.
Yes.
I just want to make one other comment about that. In many countries around the world, this issue is the same. This is just a chronic and unfortunately hugely problematic way of looking at people who use drugs as though they are demons, junkies, throwaways, disposables, people whose lives don't matter, because we've allowed ourselves to believe this rhetoric around the drug war that the drug itself allows that person to be robbed of their agency, so they are no longer actually a human being, they are just a drug, which is why if you go to Brazil, they're called zombies or the Walking Dead. This is like around the world, to the point where in the Philippines now, the president is actually calling on let's just shoot them all. And I just want to make that point, because we can talk all about how great certain treatments are and other treatments aren't, and I believe that that's absolutely the case. However, we've allowed poverty and social justice and racial injustices to define people as being othered and so irrelevant in society that you throw drugs in the mix and then we blame the drug on the eradication of people that we just basically don't want to see. We don't want them around. And so it becomes a very convenient mechanism to use to just not look at all the social injustices that we're having to struggle with in our society. And they do that everywhere in the world. So we see it in Thailand, we see it in Indonesia, the rounding up of the sort of disposables and throwing them into drug treatment centers where basically people get raped and tortured. No one gives a fuck. They're just treated terribly badly. And it's all in the name of drug treatment. So we don't have it as badly as that here, but it's on a continuum. And I think that the point is we mix up the issues sometimes, and one of the bigger factors is that we can, just use the excuse of not really having unpacked the difference between what drugs are doing to people and what society is doing to people, and we see it in the scared straight videos that cops show, like if you try drugs, this is what you look like, and they show some person who's grown up in poverty and lives selling their body on the street corner, and it's like, this is what's going to happen to you if you get into drugs, and it's got nothing to do with that. This person has been sexually molested since their childhood. They've grown up in poverty. They've never been, a million other reasons why.
So we're getting short on time, and I want to make sure you guys have a chance to ask questions. I've been dominating conversation. Just raise your hand, I think, is going to be the system, right? And then stand and shout it out. I think this woman here had her hand up very first.
So I have a question about prevention. So what's the idea? How would that actually work, and how do you see it? There was some mention with pain and what to do on the societal level. And then the videos, like if those scared straight don't work, what should be used? Because I think
what is prevention? And let me add, because there were several people with hands, and I want to sort of make it a bit of a fire round.
Okay, so basically for prevention, what you want to do, kids with outlying temperaments are at high risk of addiction, but they have different temperaments, so it's not like there's one addictive personality. So a very anxious kid, a very bold kid, somebody on the extreme of anything is going to be at higher risk, and those temperaments also put them at higher risk for various mental illnesses. So what you want to do is very early on identify those kids, but do not label them. Help them to come up with ways, like if a kid's very impulsive, how do I come up with cognitive and behavioral ways to not be impulsive that are appropriate to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or whatever. Well, they're going to be impulsive, but like that. You want to focus on teaching coping skills, reducing poverty, reducing inequality, all these kind of big things. Like if you really want to have a society that has less addiction, you have to have a kinder, less unequal society. But on an individual basis, focus on personality, on coping, on childhood trauma, and if you can mitigate and the effects of these things, you can create a caring community in your school, you will do well with prevention. Teach empathy, basically.
And thank you for bringing that to us. I'm going to take 2 at a time. So here, and if you're still, these 2 right here. Each of you go, and then we'll put them both to the panel.
So I've seen the play, and the main girl obviously has issues in her family. Her parents are splitting up, her mom is leaving, so there's definitely issues in her life, and you talked about antidepressants. So I feel like there's a lot of shaming around depression and anxiety and those mental health issues that are quite common. And do you guys think that the drug use is related to the fact that depression is shamed, and it's easier to go to recreational drugs that might look cooler than saying I'm depressed, I need clinical help?
Before you answer, let's get the second question.
All right, well, I got interested in this topic from working in the rehabs in Florida, which is kind of like the wild, wild west, if you're familiar with it. And I admire your writings, Maya. And one of the ideas that I've seen you read that you've mentioned is about this idea of unearned pleasure, and how we look at, we sort of stigmatize drug use as it's unearned pleasure. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
So first, Leslie, on depression and its role in all of this.
Sure, well, we're focusing on how much addiction is stigmatized, while mental illness, of course, so much stigma around as well. So, and back to the point of developing, coping strategies and ways to manage our emotional experiences. That drugs are a way to do that, and in a way that can be sort of cool or acceptable or everything our friends are doing. And so I think it's an important thing to give as much space as we can also if we're talking about managing depression, feeling depression and anxiety, trying as we are with addiction to some degree to like open the conversation to like normalize to a degree so that, and understanding the function of drug use in that way. If we can understand the function, we can understand what we need to replace that with, ultimately, how we can help people manage their experience in a way that's, not so destructive.
And on unearned pleasure, I believe the phrase is?
Yes, so
It's an evocative phrase for sure.
Yes, well, we have our Puritan roots here in America, and we do feel that, like, if you work hard and do right, like, God will bless you and you will be rich. And the reality, of course, is that life is often horribly unfair on many different dimensions. But we don't like drugs because in some sense we feel that they might be able to equalize that like, some poor guy who is like, not productive might get the most blissful experience by like smoking crack, and wouldn't that be horrible because then nobody would ever be productive, and so there is this very deep fear in America about unearned pleasure, and part of the reason we hate people with addiction and part of the reason we hate fat people is because we think that they are getting this kind of extra pleasure, and that that they didn't earn that through like hard exercise and self-deprivation.
How dare you be high?
No, but it's funny, but it's like real, right? So I think it's really important that we understand that so that we can get better at dealing with it, because what's actually going on, people with addiction have extra pain, not extra pleasure, for the vast majority of the time. And what I like to look at it like, if you're at a mood level of -10 and you take drugs and it brings you up to +10, that is going to be much more addictive for you than if you're at a mood level of normal and you go up to +10, because that's like only 10, not 20. And so you're just more likely to get trapped if you are in some kind of painful state because your nervous system is different. And so I think it's really important for us to embrace neurodiversity and embrace the fact that we all have different temperaments. They all bring different stuff to the table. Not all bad stuff, good stuff too. So,
Scott and Alex/Greg, back on the depression question, because it really was sort of catalytic almost in the show, and I'd also say beyond the mother's depression, I felt like it was sort of a communal depression. Just how did depression play in the way you thought about this, or did it play a role?
Well, yeah, I think that, many people are depressed. There's a lot of depression out there, me included. No, I'm only kidding. But but I think that I was interested in what you were saying before, because I think that some people just, people don't know they're depressed. A lot of people just sort of exist in this sort of way and go through life depressed and might self-medicate or, so yeah, I think that it did play a lot because, everybody, that's the idea of the play. Everybody is grappling with their own stuff while this poor girl is dying, somebody said something interesting about that before, about, when, I guess when we're talking about blame, that in the play, everybody is sort of blaming everybody, and it isn't until the girl is really close to death that people start blaming themselves, and I think that's sort of brave in a weird way. That's what I find personally moving about the play. And so yeah, depression is, I think you could isolate depression in every character, even in this one. There's a lot of sort of stuff going on, and I think, this is sort of, it's a very, very, very little story, about a very, very small group of people, but it says so many big things about just life and the conditions in which we live. And I think mental illness or depression or, anything like that. It's so, it's just a big part of our condition, and people just live their lives. Many people live their lives not knowing it or doing anything about it. It's sort of sad.
What is Greg's depression?
He just wants to drink.
I think Greg is pretty satisfied with his life.
Artistic disagreement.
No, I mean,
No, but I think,
if
but
they're...
before you were saying about, like, you know, the fear of losing somebody, the fear of, like, so there's that sort of anxiety that may be not depression, but like high levels of anxiety.
And also that he's sort of been given the shaft his entire life. You know, the person that he wanted to rely on the most beat him and broke his bones. And then when he reached out to other like heroes, this guy who comes to the bar every night, who was his history teacher, you know, he's just, you know, Greg loves all these people and like really just wants them to show up for him and like see him, and none of them do. I mean, his wife literally trashes him every chance she gets. Says he can't act, says that he like, you know, has a hairy butt, is not good in bed.
What's wrong with a hairy butt?
Nothing, but like, I mean, when that's the characteristic that she's pointing out, it's not like the most, like, oh, he's got a great jawline, and you know, no.
Yeah, but I think interesting. I mean, this is a terrible term I'm going to say. It's probably a better word for it. But the dry drunk. Do you know what I mean? The person who has, you know, who you know, everybody likes better when they're. You know what I mean? That there's something about Greg's anger in the play that sort of makes me think of, well, I don't want to, because you have to play it for a couple more weeks, but, or to put a label on it, but there's something about the person who's sober, who has not conquered the stuff that, you know, made them, and then so it comes out in very aggressive ways. That's a phrase for that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, we can debate over whether that's a true thing, but there's definitely a thing that happens sometimes with people with addiction when they haven't addressed their stuff and they're just white knuckling it, as they say in 12-step programs. But I think also when 12-step programs work for people, as they seem to have done in his life, there comes a great sense of meaning and purpose in helping other people with addiction. And that is real and valuable, and the spirituality of that is real and valuable. Like, there are plenty of things that one can criticize, but I do think this idea of one person with addiction helping another one and just being there and creating a community out of, you know, where it was all broken, that I believe is like an amazing, wonderful thing. And we, you know, I think it was Johann Hari said something along the lines of the opposite of addiction is not recovery, but it is connection and community. And, you know, really the ways that we are all broken and taken apart from each other and unable to connect, that are exacerbated by inequality and all this other stuff. You know, when we can heal each other and connect to each other and be there for each other, that is the most amazing thing, and that is how you can often, you know, get over these things. And sometimes you might need a little medication also.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. Quickly, though, Scott, we've got a couple more weeks to see it for the folks who haven't seen it, correct?
Yeah, come check it out. 2 more weeks.
Before you go, I must ask this question. I really do.
Please, very, very quickly.
I'm really sorry. But can you talk a little bit more about the move from criminalization to treatment? Because I know during the crack epidemic, it was throw them in jail, lock them up. But now it's treatment. It's treatment. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how it moved from criminalization to treatment?
So first off, have we made that move? And then secondly...
We're attempting to make that move, but I actually think that one of the things is, if we are going to believe that addiction is a disease or any kind of medical disorder, we cannot be putting people in cages for it at all. You must decriminalize possession of all substances before we're going to be able to actually treat addiction as a medical problem. For example, with alcoholism, we lock people up if they hurt somebody else. We don't lock people up just for drinking. We recognize that putting people in a cage for that does not work. America has for a long time used racism. Our drug policy has basically just been an instrument of racism. It has not been a drug policy that is actually aimed at helping people with addiction or helping people who use drugs. It's just aimed at locking people up. If we actually do want to help people, we have treatments that work. We have harm reduction philosophies that are really, really helpful. We know how to deal with this, but we have to end criminalization, at least of possession, and probably, I think, ultimately of dealing, if we are going to actually treat this as a medical problem, because we don't have the donut police. We don't lock up people we don't think that we can treat type 2 diabetes by putting people in jail for eating sugar. We recognize that that is stupid. And we need to recognize that for people with addiction, and I think you should talk a bit about criminalization.
Well, I'll just quickly say that the treatment for people who have problematic drug use isn't necessarily about taking the drug away. There's so many other things that are going on in that person's life, and there's so many things in the policy environment that are making it impossible for them to get well, that we need to really redefine what treatment looks like for people. And rather than keeping it restricted to the medical profession, I think we need to start thinking about all sorts of policy interventions that people who use drugs need at all levels of society, starting with better drug education in schools, more openness in conversations about the reality of what's happening, and then looking at what I call low barrier programs, which are the places where we engage people who are actively using and treat them with some humanity and some dignity, and not wait for them to die before we start to show that we care.
Dare I say, I think there are probably a great many places in American society where we could move from criminal justice to a different solution.
Seriously.
We do have to leave it there. I apologize. I know there are a great many more questions that we would ask. But Scott Elliott, the artistic director and director of the Whirligig, Alex Hurt, who stars in the Whirligig, Leslie Daly, Liz Evans, and Maya Salovitz. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to all of you.
And you.
You're watching a special live presentation on the BeTerrific Network.